Buddy, I appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day for us. For, like what Randy kind of alluded to, a subject that for some might be pretty dry. But for others who are into development and working with code, I think you'll find this a very, very interesting interesting path to take on automating your inventor design. So a necessary slide deck before we get started, of course, if you're not familiar with us and who we are. I'm Carl Smith, Director of the Professional Services Group throughout North America. Randy is a member of our team out of the Carolinas who does a lot of my development stuff, our clients' development stuff, and both iLogic and some VBA, things like that. So I've invited him to work the magic, to do the technical stuff with us. Imagine it as part of RAND Worldwide. A couple of us, RAND Worldwide is an umbrella company for a couple of other aspects of our business, including other softwares like Dassault Solutions, PTC training, things like that, and then the quality materials of the Ascent Group, the courseware. You buy courseware manuals, books, and stuff like that for CAD data. Generally, it's written by our sister company in Ascent. A little pushpin map that shows that I basically like to say that if you're in an area of a pushpin, that is excellent. You likely have a manufacturing technical representative in that area. But it's kind of cool. And what this means really is if we can't solve an issue locally, we have resources all over North America to help you with a solution. Our relationship with Autodesk is very, very important to us, and we like to highlight it. We're one of their largest Autodesk training center. We're one of our largest value-add resellers. We have a lot of strong and deep relationships in partnering with Autodesk with a lot of clients. And what we're probably as proud of as anything is our customer satisfaction surveys. Autodesk holds us to pretty high standards if we're going to represent them with their products, and we're very proud to have that highest standard in customer satisfaction. So that's something we like to boast for. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to show off today, and that is leveraging code that you might find somewhere, or how to convert code that you might find somewhere that's written in another language like .NET, that we can convert that and talk about what to do to make that work inside of iLogic. Naturally, the advantages to working outside of the snippet area and leveraging the API a little bit more have to do with commands that aren't available through those snippets, right? You want to create geometry. None of those kinds of snippets are there. So it's a huge advantage to be able to extend what those snippets are and do other things working with the API. Here's an example of some API code that was taken and culled and put into iLogic. I said API code, .NET code that's calling on the API. That simply changes the pattern of a hole based on the shape of a sketch, right? So you really can't do that with a snippet inside of iLogic. You're going to need something further. So this code was taken, was found somewhere on the web, or somebody developed. I don't remember exactly where it all came from, but it was written in a .NET format and brought over, and we were able to convert it into iLogic, and runs fine inside the iLogic window. That's what this kind of presentation is all about today. If you're not familiar, of course, we want to talk about what the definition of the API is. The programming interface. It's the commands that Inventor that you have access to that Inventor uses. Right? You have access to do something, call on these commands, query these commands. You use them as to basically do a whole lot more to it from an automation standpoint. Right? So that's the API when I refer to that. That's the commands that are available to you to write into code. Right? Don't worry too much about that one. So the VBA model is pretty easy to get to. You can explore the API if you're a developer and understand how it works. But most of us are here because we're looking at other people's code. You go on the web. The Autodesk knowledge base is a great resource for these kind of things, and you look at you kind of review the problem domain. What are you trying to solve? I want to do this with Inventor, and you'll see similar solutions. In the programming, there's the help section of the API in Inventor is really nice. Has a lot of suggested code snippets and all those kind of things. And what you'll end up with is code that looks like that, right? It's .NET format, dim statements and class statements and all that kind of stuff. You can't just simply cut and paste that type of code into the iLogic window and expect it to run. You'll get errors and it doesn't understand what's going on, all those kind of things. So the focus on today is, okay, what are you going to do when you find this code? What do you need to do? What do you need to look at to get things cleaned up and available for you to use in the iLogic model? So with that being said, I am going to pass over the presentation to Mr. Mayberry. You should see it, sir, and you have the con.
Thank you very much, Carl.
All right.
My screen here. And let me know when you can see that, if you can, sir.
Yep, you're good to go.
All righty. So good afternoon, everybody. As Carl mentioned, my name is Randy Mayberry. I am an applications expert for the MSD team, the Manufacturing Solutions team. I am out of semi-warm North Carolina today. Hopefully the rest of you are staying as warm as I am. Unfortunately, you guys in the north are probably freezing right now. So before we get going, just a little bit more to touch on what Carl had mentioned about VB.NET, VBA, and iLogic, and what exactly those are. So when we start talking about VB.NET or .NET, that's an object-oriented program interface. It's a language. It was a successor to Visual Basic, and most .NET development is done in Visual Studio. You can go out and download Visual Studio Express. It's a free copy, and then you can go all the way up to the professional version if you're building for clients or for an enterprise situation. And then we also have VBA, which is Visual Basic for Applications. That was based on VB6, which is a much older version than what .NET is based upon. And that's where some of those issues come in when we start talking about bringing in VBA programs and trying to get them to work inside of iLogic. A very large percentage of the samples that you find out there on the internet are VBA examples. And what I'm looking at here is a sample out of the Inventor knowledge base. It's a sample for going through the model parameters, and this is a VBA program. Okay? And we're going to use this guy and go through and see what I have to change in order to make that run inside of iLogic. iLogic is an add-on on top of an Inventor that allows you to easily write .NET programs. It's kind of a friendly wrapper that sits on top of that API. So when I start looking at snippets inside of a rule or in the iLogic rules editor, these snippets that are listed over here on the left, those are actually classes, objects, and things that are inside of the library. Okay, it's just a nice, friendly way for me to access data as opposed to writing it out through .NET and accessing the API directly. Okay. When you write a rule inside of iLogic, inside of this rules editor, and run it, it wraps it inside of a function, and then that function is what's running inside of .NET. Okay. So as Carl mentioned, most of you probably start off using these snippets, right? I go make a new rule inside of my component. You know, maybe I want to modify a parameter, so I'm simply double-clicking these entities, getting that information in there, and modifying those arguments as needed in order to do what I need to do. At some point, you're going to hit that iLogic wall, right? There's only so many snippets that are in here. I can only do so much kind of stuff. So I have to go out and do other things that aren't, quote, available inside of iLogic. Okay? So you go out to the web, you go search somewhere. You might go to the knowledge base, right? If you go to the programming help inside of Inventor, I can find samples of programs, very similar, again, to this model parameter loop that we're looking at here. Okay? You go out there, you grab it, you copy and paste it, and you get all kinds of errors. Okay? Chances are, again, what you found there wasn't iLogic code. It's probably VBA if you got it off of the Inventor knowledge base. Okay? Stuff that's posted out on the Autodesk discussion groups, that's quite often VBA as well. Okay. So when I copy and paste this stuff and put it inside of Inventor, one thing to be careful of is the security. Okay? That's one of the first things I want to talk about is just blindly copying and pasting code off of the internet and sticking it in your rule and running it. Right? We want to make sure that it's not malicious code. Okay? So as of Inventor 2018.2, let's show this real quick. They increased the security options or releasing security options. I can get those through my event triggers, or I can also get to those through the iLogic Advanced Configuration dialog box. So right now, if I'm looking at the event triggers here, up in the upper left, I have this options button. Okay. I highly suggest that if you're copying code off of the internet or somewhere else, code that you didn't even develop, and running it, go in here and turn this on. Okay. It's going to look for certain things. Those things aren't clearly defined as of right now by Autodesk, but the majority of it is if I remember going out and accessing my hard drive for any reason. It's going to say, hey, you know, this could be malicious code. So I'm going to show an example of that here real quick. I've got a rule in here called bad internal rule. If I try to run that thing, my security alert is going to pop up. Okay, it's going to say I either have the option of choosing don't run this rule or going ahead and allowing that rule. If I choose don't run this rule and then go back into my security options and look at my disabled rules that's up in here in the upper right, that's listed as one that it's not going to allow to run. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and enable that guy just so I can let him run back again. If I come down here to the bottom, I can see details about that. And it tells me some kind of generic information about what's going on. What's the reason it flagged this one? Okay, there's a system IO file copy line inside of that rule. Okay, it's doing something to my hard drive in this instance. Why it's saying, hey, maybe we don't want to run this. Okay. If I go ahead and choose run this rule, I have a couple different options. Okay, this is an internal rule. It's a rule that's inside of my part, not an external rule. I can either assume all the rules that are inside of this file are okay, or all the rules that are coming from this project are okay. So I'll go and hit OK. The rule ran. All it's simply doing is going and copying a spreadsheet from one location to another. Go ahead and pop in there and take a look at that thing. This is the line right here that was causing the security option to mark it as possibly malicious code. Okay. If I go look at my security options now, since I've marked that as allowing to run, it's listed as the files that are coming from parameter part are considered okay. I'm not going to check rules from these locations. Okay. By the same token, it does the same thing with external rules. If I try to run an external rule here it's quote bad, it's the exact same rule, it's just sitting out somewhere else. I have the same options there, and it's going to run the same checks. The only difference being how it marks those security options. Okay, I've got external rules specific or external rules folders that I can allow and disallow. Okay. So again, if I'm going out copying things off the internet, even for someone who works in this stuff all day long, like myself, I still have that security option turned on. Okay, I very rarely do I just blindly go copy some code. You should always go through and understand what it's doing, just to make sure. Again, we're not going to do anything to your hard drive or anything like that. Okay. So I'll go back to this rule here that we found on the Inventor knowledge base, right? It's looping through some model parameter data and then giving me information back about it. Okay? If I look up here at the top, it is a VBA sample. Some of them also have C# examples. Okay? So I'm going to copy and paste this, go all the way down to the bottom, Control-C, jump back to my part, start a new rule, give it a nice name, and then Control-V to paste it. Okay. As I take a look at this code, you'll see that some of these commands, some lines, they have squigglies down underneath them. Okay. With the 2019 updates for the Inventor iLogic rules editor, I now have information about what's going on inside of there. It's almost like Word, right? It's saying, hey, there's a problem here with this, this command or this word. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it as it is and hit save and run. Right? I just copied, pasted, and tried to run it. The first thing that happens here is says, hey, this has to contain a sub main and an end sub. Okay? This is one of the main things that when you're trying to convert code from VBA or even VB.NET into iLogic, is it needs to have a sub that's called main. When I initially started talking off, we were talking about rules that you write, and that, if I don't have a subroutine in there or a sub in there, the iLogic will wrap that in a sub main and then run. Okay. So what does this mean is this public sub that's listed up at the top, it has to be named main. Okay. And it has to be, if I'm using multiple methods, it has to be the first that's listed inside of there. Okay. What I mean by multiple methods is if I have subroutines or if I have functions that are also in my code. Okay. If I'm not doing any of that, I could be fine and dandy with just deleting the end sub and deleting that top line. Okay. If I were going to have other subroutines and other functions inside of there, then I would need the sub main and then the end sub at the very end of this guy. Okay. A subroutine is just a method or a process that performs a task. Okay. A function is the exact same thing, but it returns a value back to me. Okay. I got another example of a rule there pulled up, and we'll talk about that subroutine and that function a little bit more. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and try to run this guy again. And I see all kinds of other information there. The debugging inside of the iLogic rules editor isn't fantastic. It does tell me where that line is, and it gives me some general information about what's going on when it's trying to compile that rule. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. I'm going to close this guy and open up this other rule called function example. Okay. We look here, I have a submain up here at the top. Okay. It's defining some parameters. It's going through the parameters. It's running some other functions called isLengthParam or isAngleParam right there. Okay. And down below that is my isLengthParam function and then my isAngle function. Okay. So my main portion of my code where the majority of the processing is happening is in my main. And then I'm calling out those functions down below. Again, the major difference between a function and a subroutine is a function returns a value. Okay. So I'm checking here the isLengthParam, which means it's going to run this function here, and it's going to return a Boolean value. Okay. Same thing with the isAngleParam. Again, the major difference there is whether or not I need to get information back or simply run a task. Okay. When I'm coding, if I find myself writing the same code over and over and over, then the light goes in my head, hey, maybe I could write this as a subroutine, or maybe I could write this as a function. Therefore, I'm just calling that chunk of code out multiple times as opposed to writing it. Okay. It's a much cleaner method. It's a much more efficient way of writing it. If I ever have to come back and modify something in a chunk of code, I only have to go down to that function and do it, as opposed to the 50 times that I put it in my code somewhere else. Okay. So I went back into my parameters here, and we'll take a look at what else is the next error. This is one of the other main ones when I'm trying to copy it from VBA to iLogic is let and set statements. Okay. Let statements are no longer allowed or they're no longer supported. The reason for this is that the set statement is an old VBA hangover. Okay. It's used to differentiate the assignment of an object versus the default property of an object. Okay? Default properties are no longer used in .NET, and remember, iLogic is based on .NET, therefore, I don't need the set statements anymore. Okay? Generally, the thing I do with this guy is go do a replace. Okay? If I hang or hover over that set statement there, again, I have that little squiggly line down below it. It tells me that there's a statement expected there. I'm simply going to wipe that out by doing a Control-C, going up to my find. I'm going to keep that space on the far end of it, and then not put anything in into my replace. Okay, and then replace all in this rule. I got rid of my set. Okay, so let's try it again. Move on to save and run. I'm still getting a bunch of other errors here, telling me that method arguments must be enclosed inside of parentheses. VBA has some weird things about parentheses, or weird rules about parentheses, and doesn't always jive well when I try to put that inside of iLogic. Okay. Sometimes iLogic requires parentheses and around an argument, and the VBA does not. Inside of VBA, if I'm using parentheses, I have to actually use a call statement. If I'm just calling a function and don't need a value back from it, then those parentheses are optional. Okay. It's a very difficult thing and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But what it's yelling about here is there are no parentheses around this debug print. Okay. It doesn't understand what's supposed to be happening there. If I go ahead and put parentheses around that, well, notice my little squiggly line there that was underneath that is now gone. Okay. Debug print is something that's used by VBA in order to display information out to my immediates window. Okay. If you're ever debugging things inside of VBA, the debug print is a way of throwing that data out so I can see what's happening in my code. I can see what those parameters are. I can see why I'm in a certain block of a conditional statement. Again, a lot of those programs out there on the knowledge base use debug.print. Okay. That's not going to do me a whole lot of good in this situation. So I've got multiple other things that I can change that to. I can use the iLogic logger as long as I'm in Inventor 2019. They came out with the logger information. So in this case, again, rather than going line by line, I can search and replace here. Replace my debug print with logger.info. I'm going to go ahead and put the open parentheses on there. That'll fix most of these. I'll have to go back and change that one that I manually changed. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and replace all in rules, and then manually fix that one that I had modified there. Now, I still have an error here because I had opened up my parentheses and I don't have a close on my parentheses. Right? You can see those little squiggly lines at the back ends of those guys. So I would have to populate that information to close off those arguments. Okay. And that looks like about all of them. Okay. So again, 2019, I think it was the .1 update gave us this logger. If I go down to the very bottom of my rules editor here inside of iLogic, I can change what that log level is. And basically, whatever I put behind the word logger, that next method it's going to show everything from that method down. Okay, so I put log info. I'm going to see infos, I'm going to see warnings, etc. Okay. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of this rule. There's something else going on inside of this rule that I don't necessarily want to have happen at this time. It's all this information about actually modifying parameters. I want you to go look at the parameters, but I don't want you changing any of it for right now. So I'm going to manually go through them and delete those. Okay. So let's take a look at make sure we can run now. If I pick save and run, no errors. My rule ran. If I take a look at my logger window here, we see that it's looping through all of those parameters, the length parameter, the width parameter. And for each one of those, it's giving me the information about what type of parameter it is, its value, and then its health, whether or not it's up to date or not. I'm going to jump back into my rule there real quick. Move this guy over a little bit, and we can understand, what's going on there. Again, I'm looping through my params here, throwing out data to the logger window, right? There's my all parameters call, and then here's where that guy is showing up in my logger window. Okay. There is a blog post that I did maybe 6 months ago about the logger. If you want to go out to our Imagine It solutions page, you can read some more information about how that works. It's a very handy tool. In addition to that, if you don't want to use the logger, there's another program called Debug View that I use quite often, and it's the same thing. It throws out information to a screen, and I can see it as it's running. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that guy. I'll start another rule here. And a little bit more about those parentheses when I'm moving things from VBA. If I simply try to draw a message box, if I could type today, right? This is the way it would come inside of VBA. I don't need those parentheses. Okay, when I was copying something over. Inside of iLogic, I'm going to need those parentheses in order for that to work. Okay. You may also see an actual call statement in front of there inside of VBA. I'll go ahead and shorten that. Okay. If the call statement is there, then I do need the parentheses inside of VBA, and that works just as fine inside of iLogic. Okay, so when you get those messages about missing arguments there, typically that's what that is. But now those work just fine inside of here. Okay, so some more things when we start talking about developing in .NET. Carl had mentioned that. There are some other things that differ between developing in .NET, developing in iLogic, and then developing in VBA. One is the lower bound of arrays. Okay, .NET, the lower bound of an array is always 0. In VBA, you can change what those upper bounds and lower bounds are. Okay, so what I mean by that is if I'm calling out an array, as such, and if I'm doing that inside of .NET, there's going to be 6 entities inside of that because my lower bound is always 0. Okay. If I'm taking something over from VBA, the difference there would be that my lower bound could be modified. Right? I can even change it with things like the to statement there. Right? Then I'm starting at 1. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 instead of 0. Okay. So when I'm something else to be careful of when I'm copying that data over or that code over from VBA, make sure you know where your arrays are starting at, or your index might be off 1 than what you think. Okay. Another difference is enumerators, how they work in .NET versus how they work in iLogic and VBA, or I should say how they work in .NET and iLogic versus how they work in VBA. Okay? In VBA and or in iLogic, I don't need to call out the enumerator type. Okay? And what I mean by enumerator type is if I'm writing some value equals okay, vertical dimension type. All right, if I'm setting a variable or an object to be a specific dimension type out of my dimension enumerators, I don't have to specifically call out the enumerator name. Oops, if I could type. Since I'm working in iLogic here, as soon as I put in that dimension type enum and hit my separator there, my period, I get that list, my handy IntelliSense that pops up. Okay. So again, coming over from VBA, it wouldn't necessarily have to have that that enumerator name on the front end, the first half of that thing. Okay. So again, something else to keep in mind as you're transporting code over back and forth. So let me go ahead and cancel here. Something that kind of goes along the lines with what Carl had shown there at the beginning on his slide. So I started a new rule here. I copied a piece of rule that I found. Where did I get this off of? I either got it off of the Mod the Machine website or possibly from the Inventor knowledge base. Okay. And I simply copied and pasted in there. And notice that it separated this thing here for me. Okay. It's putting up information up at the top in what's called the header section. Okay. Again, this was a 2018, I believe, where they included that header. Okay. I can turn it off if I don't want to necessarily look at it. And that's where all the importing information is happening there. Okay, that import or Inventor line up at the top is giving me access to the Inventor API objects without having to specifically call out that library name. Okay, not so beneficial necessarily when I'm developing inside of VBA or if I'm developing inside of iLogic, because that access is already there. Okay, it's built in there for me. But if I was developing a program inside of .NET, let me do something as simple as this face down here at the bottom. Instead of dimming O-face as face, because it understands what the word face is. If I hover there for a second and I see that little tooltip over to the right, it's telling me inventor.face. Okay, Inventor is the library that thing is coming out of. I don't have to specifically call out inventor.face. If I'm developing in something else, such as Visual Studio for a .NET application, maybe I'm building some external application, okay? I have to specifically call out what that library is, unless I'm using the imports up top. Okay? If I have this line where it says imports Inventor, then I can ignore that and not have to worry about it. Okay? That takes care of all that interface there for me. Okay? If I'm pasting something like this in here, there's no harm in keeping that inside of my iLogic rules editor, keeping that imports Inventor up there. It's going to run just fine. Some of the other benefits of developing inside of iLogic are here where I'm getting this application. Okay, because it's an add-in for Inventor, I don't need to worry about converting this. I don't have to worry about going out and getting that application, right? I can use the disapplication.active document. Okay. It already understands what this application means, very similar to the snippets over on the left. Okay. It realizes that that's an inventor.application, and it's going to use the current instance of that. Okay. So if I wanted this guy to run here, I don't need these two top lines or this top line at all. This application already exists. Okay. So again, my set statements are no good. I got to get rid of those guys. There's only a few there, so I'm going to go ahead and manually delete those. Something else here that I can change, I don't have to if I don't want to, is how I'm calling out my component definition here. Right? The component definition is where a lot of things lie inside of the object model of the API. All of my features are inside there. My work features are inside of there. Generally, anything that I want to do, now, I shouldn't say that. 60% of the time, maybe, you're getting inside of the component definition. Okay? Since it understands what this means, I don't have to call it out this way. I could also use the iLogic snippet of this application dot active document. Okay, so I'm getting the component definition of that object. So if we take a look at this, it's just getting that that part definition. It's getting a face, right? In this case, it's getting the very first face. It's creating a sketch on that face, and it's going to rename that sketch to my new sketch. So I hit save and run. It created a sketch over here on this face, and then that guy is now residing there. Okay. There's some other minor changes that are in between in iLogic and in VB.net. You can declare and set variables at the same time. You can't do that inside of VBA. And what I mean by that, if I jump back into this rule, right here we're declaring oFace as face. I could have left this like this to declare it and set it at the same time. Okay. Can't do that in VBA. Nothing wrong with keeping it the other way. Sometimes it's a little bit clearer. It does use one more line in your code. Okay. So for those who didn't know, VBA does come with Inventor, right? It's included inside there. The way to get to it is through my Tools tab in my Options panel. There's my VBA editor right there. Okay. And I think we've talked about it a few times. As I'm doing development, I will jump into VBA because it's much easier to find the object model and understand what properties and methods I have there, other than through the Inventor iLogic IDE, the rules editor. I will say with the last few updates, they've got a little bit better, specifically with that IntelliSense stuff. Right? I can go through and find other objects there. Alrighty. That's it for my technical presentation there, Mr. Carl.
All right. I had to come off mute there. Thank you very much, Randy. I can wrap up with a few extra slides, and we'll let everybody have their day back. Got it. Thank you, sir. Huh? Did you pass the presentation on to me? Make me the presenter? There we go.
Yep.
Thank you, sir. So just to get things wrapped up, what you've seen this afternoon is an example of, ways, methodologies, techniques, those types of things that our team uses to develop everything from configurators to simple automated routines inside of Inventor. It can be a fairly simple process for simple configurations, and it can be very, very complex, making lots of calls to the API. So depending on your skill set and your bandwidth, you may be able to take advantage of some of our professional services that include both the consulting end of it, as well as the actual automation and software development side of things. A lot of folks like to have us do a project and get all the code written. None of it's compiled or anything like that, and use that as a template to take off and continue on from there, especially if you're not overly familiar with, with the API. We often attach extra time at the end of a project to I guess, to unwrap it, to bring it in, get it implemented, talk about how it works, what you need to do to continue with it from there. All that kind of stuff is all part of our project offering. We do offer some online and self-paced learning portals for iLogic and development, but it's kind of restricted down to the fundamentals. It's really, really hard to get somebody into a .NET ready state on a 2-day class, unless you're already there. It's really difficult to do. So depending on your, like I said, depending on your bandwidth and your current skill set, we're happy to assist in your next project moving forward from here. In addition, this is our random extra slide, right? The set of Ginsu knives. In addition to all of those services for training and consulting, we want you to remember that we represent a lot of areas in the reality capture services, scanning and bringing those into Inventor and doing things with them, as well as other offerings that include facilities management, civil, architectural, all that kind of good stuff. So I guess I'm ready to continue forward. Cassie, do we have a list of questions or anything like that that we can help answer?